Hi everyone. I'm going to talk this time about a book that is very important. It's a recent Nobel Prize winner's book. Laszlo Krasznahorkai is a Hungarian writer, Hungarian like myself, and he wrote Satantango, um, literally tango of Satan, um, back in the 1980s. And he wrote many books. He's a quite prolific author. He publishes a new book every 1-2 years usually. But I think this early book is one of his best key works. His style and topics have, of course, changed throughout his career, so this is not the only book that's worth reading by him. But it's definitely one of the outstanding books, and besides books like War and War or The Prisoner of Urga, it's one of the great Krasznahorkai books. So if you're interested in this recent Nobel Prize winner's work, I just give a couple of points to explain why this is an interesting and great book. So I want to talk about 5 key points here. Historical context, a little bit about the Hungarian literary context, the philosophical sociological background of the book's style, and a couple of further virtues that I couldn't put in a single category very easily. It's a very unique novel. There is little action in the sense of characters going from point A to point B, but there's a lot of things happening in terms of the characters' internal life and the community life and how the relations shift between the cast. In that sense, it's very fast-paced and it's very easy to read. The historical context of the book is it's set at the time when the Soviet Union is collapsing, and Hungary and some of the other Soviet allies, which were quasi-member states, right? Like today, people say, "Oh, we were not Soviet states." Well, they very much were. They were just part of this political unit with slightly different contractual frameworks. So they were shifting more and more towards mixed economic models. This started well before the regime change. The regime change in East Europe wasn't cataclysmic. The political parties that were the ruling parties, which were affiliated with Moscow, basically all agreed in the late 80s that it was time to shift and change. Romania was one of the big examples where Ceausescu had to be forced out, but Hungary, Poland, and a couple of other places had very peaceful transitions of power. The former elite and the new incoming elites managed to negotiate the handover of power and the renegotiation of the frames of how the state works. And the economy was already in the 70s, 80s becoming more and more open towards competitive ideas, private ownership, and so on. But it's really the last bit of the 80s, especially in Hungary, Poland, and a couple of other places, Czech Republic, where we see a significant relaxation for private businesses. More and more people own their own shops, and smaller or larger little little workshops and things like that. And there were a lot of legal reforms. Trade was becoming again more and more opened up towards Western countries which belonged to the NATO bloc, the US bloc, the enemy bloc at the time, right? At the same time, there was less funding for traditional models, which were designed to help the most disadvantaged people, and less money to agriculture. So especially in the Hungarian context, but in general in East Europe, agriculture was still very important. What you have to see is that, sometimes people think that there hasn't been much development in this region during the Soviet times. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was enormous development, because these countries were mostly agricultural, semi-feudal countries before World War II. Industrialization wasn't nearly as far progressed as in West Europe or in the US. So when World War II happened, these countries, the countryside was still owned mostly by former aristocracies or people connected to them, and the legal systems still recognized titles by birth and different rights based on nobility and ridiculous, horrible discriminating things like that. Many of these countries had different kind of monarchies, Bulgaria and so on. And some people lived in literal mud huts, millions of people just in Hungary, not to mention across the region. The Soviets set up much larger unified companies and farms and made sure that everyone had work and everyone had modern, clean living spaces. And this was crumbling. And there were new social currents as well, and inequality was emerging too, right? So people were allowed to do more business, branch out more, earn more. That, of course, brought back some social problems, and some people tried to take advantage of this with Ponzi schemes, and a lot of hucksters were running around who promised that they can do business with Western entities and make you rich, and so on and so on. So it's a dangerous and it's an interesting time where some people get amazing opportunities. The majority of people face insecurity. The literary context in which Krasznahorkai has to be seen is that when the book was written, Hungary still had censorship. It wasn't very strong. So you see that in the 60s, censorship, 50s, 60s, censorship is very strong, especially in the 50s. Hungary tried a revolution against the Soviets. 1956, we tried to kick them out by military police force and civilian uprising. So there were protected fights for about a month roughly, and then the Soviets came in with a larger force, and many people were killed or executed, and the revolution was crushed. After this, of course, censorship was very strong, and this lasted well into the 60s. After the 60s, there was a gradual easing of the atmosphere, and especially after 68, right, there was a much more, definitely not liberal, but less authoritarian atmosphere, where if you published the wrong kinds of things, you didn't necessarily go to prison, definitely didn't disappear anymore, but your right to publish things could have been revoked, or you could have been blacklisted for a set amount of time, a certain number of years. Your poems or novels or books would not be published, and so on. You would still be given work, but different kinds of work, editing work, translation work, or other kinds of things. So there was some kind of literary experimentation, but of course that was less about topics, what can be said, and less political, and a lot more about how to talk about things in ways that are tolerated by the system. And there were a lot of new progressive writers emerging: Péter Eszterházy, Péter Nádas, Petri György, and other internationally very well regarded and successful writers. Eszterházy was a great inventor in form and one of the first truly postmodern Hungarian writers. Nádas is an amazing storyteller, somewhat more traditional, but also experimental in how narratives can be constructed, how the writer can separate the narrator and the point of view that the reader has on what's going on. Petri has been a great poet, really capturing people's yearning for liberation, but also the woes of how the transition to a capitalist economy was conducted in East Europe and Hungary, and some older visionaries like Mészöly Miklós, who really renewed the language of Hungarian novel writing, were all thriving at this time. So Krasznahorkai grows up in this very lively and very innovative environment, and it's a bit of a funny thing, right, that there is censorship at this time, but at the same time, exactly because the system wants to make sure that everyone is employed, right? This is a socialist communist idea. Everyone has the right to work, and everyone has the right to living by using their best abilities. They made sure that if you're a writer and you really are talented, you're gonna have the opportunity to write, and there were writers' retreats and scholarships and forms of networks making work for artist communities possible. And there was also some semi-legal intellectual life, so some people were allowed to read censored foreign materials, and of course there were circles who then discussed these, probably mostly known by the system, but it was something that wasn't really acknowledged, and then they let it slip. Learned about new philosophical work, sociological work, psychological work from the US, West Europe, and other places. Yeah, and of course, Hungary and the Soviet Union had a pretty decent and interesting intellectual life on its own, right? So that's now swept under the ground a bit, but under the rug a bit, but things were happening. Um, the next thing that's interesting here is the philosophical sociological background. So Hungary has a very strong sociological streak in philosophy. So there are a couple of great Hungarian philosophers from the last 120, 30 years. George Lukács, Lukács György, Karl Mannheim, the two Polanyi's, Aurel Kolnai, and more recently a couple of significant younger people, but all of these people were very, very interested in the history and philosophy of science, and how the hard sciences work, what are their methods, how do political, ideological, sometimes cultural factors influence the work of scientists, the interpretation, the uptake, the funding of such work. And also, they were very, very curious about the new social sciences, especially sociology, but also psychology. How do these things manage to establish facts? Do they establish facts? How does economics work? Why is it so unsuccessful in predicting anything? Is it even a science? And so on and so on. And this thinking always coupled with an interest in real lived experience of citizens, and the connection of that to politics. So in a sense, I think there has been a bit more reflection on this in mainstream culture, and definitely in intellectual circles, and it is still today seen by some writers and artists as part of their job to be informed about this kind of sociologically, politically oriented scholarship, and reflect on it, and their work should do something on it. Whereas if you look at the Anglo-Saxon world, there has been largely a turn away from this, and a turn towards, during the postmodern years, towards different ways of storytelling and constructing books, and also towards the personal and the individual, which is resulted in some amazing books, but it overall it resulted in a somewhat washed and one-sided literary life. Krasznahorkai sensed early that this kind of ideology of everything is forever, the system is going to last, the Soviet Union is going to be here forever, and we're going to live the same kind of life for generation. He sensed that this is really crumbling, and the Cold War might be coming to an end, and big changes are coming. And of course, many people dislike different aspects of the Soviet era. A lot of people suffered from their businesses having been taken away, right? So after the communist takeover in 1949, there was a big wave of larger businesses being taken over by the state, and there was a big crusade of terror against people who supported the former systems and who opposed communism, and many people had to leave the country or faced jail or disappearance if they were actively trying to support foreign powers trying to undermine the new system. And of course, this happened within 56 years, right? So people haven't, 40, 50 years, people haven't forgotten, and everyone knew someone who had someone disappear or imprisoned or suffered some other injustice, and everyone had relatives who emigrated, left the country. But at the same time, there was equality, peace, safe employment, free schooling, free sports, healthcare, broadened social services. The quality of healthcare was pretty good. Early retirement, people retired in their 50s from work. decent pensions, and so on, right? So, especially the 70s, 80s, and are remembered by a lot of older people quite fondly, and with good reasons. So, of course, the passing of this era filled a lot of people with unease, and this is captured in Krasznahorkai's books that, look, a stable system is going away. Was it a democratic system? No. But were some aspects of life good? Yes. The official Soviet line, you have to see, was a weird line. So this was a mixture of changing attitudes to Marxism, and depending on which ideologues and politicians were saying what. There were a host of different positions: orthodox, revisionist, Leninist, Stalinist, and so on. And increasingly, what we see towards the 80s, a lot of people were just exhausted and done with this. Not necessarily because it didn't have anything that was true, but simply because, especially people who are researchers or live a cultural life, want a bit more variety and explore different kinds of ideas, even if they disagree with them. So there was kind of an exhaustion with the available philosophical ideas, but they still had, of course, a strong influence on everyone. Most Hungarian thinkers were strongly egalitarian, and still many people are. But at the same time, of course, the economic and political ideas were reflecting the changing world relations. There was a lot of political realism, and people, politicians and lawmakers were trying to mix in more market-oriented ideas, because often the early communist economics were just very low quality, and there were very severe sanctions throughout the existence of the USSR by the West, right? So the USSR businesses were largely cut off from technological advances and financing from the financially much stronger Western banking and financial systems. So they had a massive disadvantage, and they were trying to make up for this. And of course, like the economists and policymakers were getting better at their jobs and figuring out what works, which is similarly to what we see in China. They managed to figure out a kind of new economic model that works for them. The USSR was too slow economically to do this, and collapsed before it could do this, but Hungary, for example, was pretty well on the way towards a heavily regulated market economy. There was a very strong sense of security, right? Because everyone was employed and had a good place to live, and this idea was cultivated by the Communist Party that things will go on like this forever. People were entitled to long holidays. There were all kinds of free cultural programs. It was very cheap to attend cultural events. They were all heavily subsidized by the state. This kind of being looked after and things just happening to you, that feeling of safe dependency was very strong during this time. At the same time, of course, there wasn't much development, so people were not used to having to adjust to new things very quickly. They were used to having to work hard, but they were used to having to work hard on similar kinds of things, especially in mid and lower ranking jobs. I'm just saying this purely on educational requirement basis, not on status or value basis. There was more free time, social cohesion, so a very different lived experience in the world than what capitalist societies have seen in the last 80 years or so, since World War II. And when this whole safety net was gone, people were extremely disoriented and anxious, especially those who weren't already preparing. The highly educated people, people who were doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, who were already business owners, who were moving in higher, mid-high policy making, ministerial circles, they were well prepared for this, economists and so on. But of course not everyone in those circles, right? So if you look at the economics, there were very large swaths of society who did lose a lot, and their quality of life never hasn't really reached the same level overall well into the 2010s, maybe even until 2020, than what it was before the change of regime. So we ended up with large inequality, right? On paper everything looks better, but it doesn't mean that that's the lived true experience of everyone. And the other thing is that, there was a very ambivalent attitude to what's coming, right? And Nietzsche was, Krasznahorkai has always been very, very sensitive to Nietzsche and very interested in Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, of course, writes about an era of European culture and society where the values are changing. Christianity has lost all intellectual credibility and ability to really dictate politics and the structure of society. And it's clear that Christianity is simply a religion, an ideology, and many people follow it, but it determines their life a lot less, and a lot less inflexibly than it used to. And people are looking for the values, for ideas on how to go on after the industrialization, after this enormous reshuffling of people, right, due to the industrialization. Probably upwards of 100 million people had to leave Europe because there was no more work due to automation. Many of them went to colonies, many of them went into the military, many of them went to the US, many of them just died from hunger or disease. So we are again, Krasznahorkai senses that this kind of cataclysmic transformation of society, and we would like to do better. So we're looking to the US as the leader of the so-called free world, as they advertise themselves at the time. And what do they bring? And we see that there is higher life quality. There is in some areas of life there is substantially more freedom, right? People can choose from more political parties, not one but two, and people have a lot more opportunity to shape the regulatory life of their local community, and there is much more participation, activism, and of course, especially in business life, a lot less regulation, competition. So we are Hungarians. We are looking forward to this and trying to find their how this is going to work out for them. But at the same time, it's the Eastern Bloc, so the same way in which there were a bit outrageous, sometimes false claims about how terrible the Soviet Union was. Not to say it wasn't terrible in many ways. There was a lot of terror and gulags and things like that. But many things are overstated or oversimplified. And at the same time, problems of the US or the West were underreported, under-discussed, same way as they are today. In the Soviet Union, the problems of the US and the West were pretty well known already, inequality and especially the US's military role in ruining a lot of countries. Like the US started the war with Vietnam, and the country was torn for 20 years into two, and there were mass murders, rapes, Indonesia, over a million people were murdered by a regime that was supported by Israel, the UK and the US. In Brazil, Chile and Argentina, the US basically aided dictators to overthrow left-leaning governments. And you see in other parts of South America and Central America, they trained paramilitary troops that tortured and murdered civilians who were not sympathetic to right-wing governments, military dictatorships that were good partners of the US. In Korea was torn into two, and so on and so on. So all this is known, right? So we are like, yeah, these guys are telling us everything's going to be better, and we see that they have more money and live a little bit better. Is everything really going to be better? So people dread what's coming as well, and there are visions of cataclysmic social change with all its elements. I might become one of the rich people, the highly successful people, the famous people, who knows. I might be able to participate in the new media machine, but you might lose everything. You might be one who is shot by the police or loses everything. And the book's style, it's written in a very unique style, which I would compare somewhat to Kafka and Thomas Bernhard, but it's quite unique. It's not just a twist on these. Krasznahorkai really has his own thing going, and the sentences are very interesting. They're long run-on sentences, and very often these force the reader to take in a lot of small details, which really transports you into the moment and the perspective of the person whose narrative you are reading or who you're following through the narrative. And it gives you sometimes perspective that you would normally not be able to perceive, and helps you to see connections that you normally wouldn't see. And also, there's a lot of poetics in the language. It's beautiful. Um, there's a lot less repetition, for example, than in Bernhard, and a lot less mysticism, I would say, than in Kafka. So that's a big difference as well. And there's a lot more of this kind of personal level, psychological level, and intersocial level reflection. Um, the immersion is amazing. It's very hard to stop reading the books. They usually encourage you to really almost experience the book as if you would go through those moments or experiences yourself, even if they are not pleasant experiences, and someone's anxiety, someone's friendship breaking up, someone not trusting someone they've known for a long time because they find out that the person is trying to trick them, or they have good reason to think that the person has lied to them or is withholding information. Um, and there's a lot of philosophical reflection and personal insights mixed in. Some of the books, for example, The Prisoner of Urga, document Krasznahorkai's experiences written into fiction. So it's not a documentary novel, but it's very heavily informed by his experiences, his travel to China through Mongolia. Very since Satantango, obviously, there are his own, but also more general social experiences. Um, and it's a very unique experience, fun experience to read this. The books are not, I wouldn't call them easy readings, despite them drawing the reader in, and they're not easy because they need, I think, concentration, they need time, so you really want to sit down and, like, read 1-2 hours continuously, and that might be a challenge for some people. The other thing is, there's no fake release, so it's not an easy read in the emotional dynamic sense. Many scenes and ideas stay with people I've talked to, not just myself, and they often expose a fake security anchored in some ideological hope or vision, right? So wherever you live, the book might push you to reflect a bit more on, like, is the story that I'm being told about my lived experiences in this community, this system I live in, really capturing what's going on? Krasznahorkai is very caring and compassionate, but he doesn't give any speeches like that. You only feel this through the way in which he's able to showcase what's going on inside people's hearts and minds, and this can be a bit like when you're watching an operation or some kind of treatment. People don't have control over these things, even if they consent to them and they're something they want. They don't have any control, and often they don't understand necessarily what's going on. So this feeling of helplessness is captured well by the books. And the lyrical language, with the little philosophical asides, really uh, really helps you to appreciate just how situated our experiences are, and how much it matters that there are people like Krasznahorkai who deeply care about capturing what's happening to people. Right. Some people mention melancholy. Um, I find that this is always tricky in Krasznahorkai. He doesn't really offer any optimistic vision or like great teaching, great takeaways, um, and sometimes the characters in the book, some of them do feel like giving up or becoming cynical or melancholic in their attitudes or moods, but usually um, Krasznahorkai doesn't try to generalize feelings into worldviews or doesn't try to say that, oh yeah, this is the way to feel about how everything is. It's more like it's understandable if someone feels this way in some situations and this happened to the character. And then let's go with the character and see what's going on and how things look from their perspective. Um, so often exactly because of the powerlessness of the characters, someone travels to a country where they don't understand the culture and don't speak the language, or someone has to flee from a country where there's a lot of violence or war, or someone is trying to find their way in a collapsing economy, where they are not a powerful economic financial player. These people don't have much control over what's going on, and so it's understandable that they're exploring the kind of mindsets and routes that might give them a way out. Um, right, so that is a lived reality that is captured here well. Yeah, this is all I wanted to highlight. It's an excellent book, Satantango, in Hungarian. If you want a starting point into Krasznahorkai, this book is one that I would definitely recommend everyone. So go forth and read, and I hope you enjoy and you find this little background picture that tries to give some context and some springboards to unlock sides of the books that might not be obvious to everyone from different cultures and countries. And have fun and read the book, please. Have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.